Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Julia Renner and I'm the Program Director for VM Mastered. VM Mastered is a training company for internal workplace investigators. During today's training, I will be monitoring the Q&A, so please submit any questions and we'll answer as many as time allows. And now I'd like to turn it over to today's presenter, Eli Makis. Eli is an instructor with VM Mastered and is a managing partner for Vandermeiden and Makis Law Corporation.
Great, thank you, Julia. And it's so great to be here with all of you. And I see that we still have folks coming into the webcast as we prepare here. But I want to just mention a couple things about VM Mastered and also a couple disclaimers about this topic before we really dig into the heart of this discussion today. So first of all, as Julia said, I'm the managing partner for Vandermeiden Makis Law Corporation, which is a law firm that is focused on conducting impartial workplace investigations. But one thing that we realized and continue to see in the marketplace is there is such a huge need for high quality workplace investigations. And really, most of the investigations should be conducted by qualified, experienced internal HR professionals. And so one of our focuses with VM Mastered is to provide training that really helps internal investigation teams develop the skills and knowledge and competence and confidence to conduct investigations internally and address most of those concerns and complaints that come to the HR function internally, as opposed to having to go out to an outside firm like ours. Now, today we're going to be talking about a topic that certainly seems cutting edge. We're going to be talking about artificial intelligence and how it may or may not impact workplace investigations. Couple disclaimers that I want to share before we dig into this. First of all, recognize that this technology is complex and fast moving, and our discussion today is not intended to be a deep dive on everything AI or even a deep dive on everything related to investigations. Rather, this is an overview of how this technology could impact positively and negatively the practice of workplace investigations. Second disclaimer, I am not an expert in AI. I am not a computer programmer. I am not a technologist in that sense. I am a lawyer and a workplace investigator first, and I've done a lot of research and practice and experimentation with artificial intelligence, really to understand how this technology impacts our work in our firm and how it's going to impact internal HR professionals and HR teams who conduct investigations. So I'm really coming at this from the perspective of an HR compliance and workplace investigation viewpoint. Finally, final disclaimer, I will be talking about a number of functions that AI can perform, but I will not be discussing or recommending any specific products. And that's true for a couple reasons. First, every organization is different, and you'll have to evaluate tools that fit your organization needs individually. Second, I frankly don't believe that there are any high-quality products on the market yet that effectively perform all of the functions that we're going to discuss. But what I can tell you is that having experimented with several different platforms and working with a tool that our firm is developing internally, I do believe that the functions we're going to discuss today are well within the reach of what the artificial intelligence technology can currently perform. So with that, why don't we jump into this? We're going to start with a couple polls because I'd like us to get to know each other. And the first poll for you is, how many workplace investigations have you completed? So be interested to hear from each of you. Is this an area that you have a lot of experience with? Are you new to workplace investigations? So if you could go ahead and answer this first poll, and I'll review the responses once we get feedback here. One thing that we know is that the workplace investigation practice, what we mean by workplace investigations can really vary from organization to organization. And so we'll spend a little bit of time in a second level setting on what do we mean by a workplace investigation per se. What an organization or an HR function is required to perform related to employee concerns or complaints can really vary. And so we'll cover kind of a basic discussion of what we mean by workplace investigations. All right, great. We have our responses up, and it looks like most of you are right in the, some experience conducting investigations. Maybe it's not the majority of your job function, but it's something that you have experience with in your current role or in the past. So we had about 10% who said they have not done an investigation before. We have 35% who have done between 1 and 10 investigations. We have 31% of the participants who have conducted between 11 and 50 investigations. I know that's a pretty broad range. And then we have about 24% people who have conducted more than 50 investigations in their practice. All right, great. Well, thank you for participating in that. I'm going to ask you to participate in one more poll. And this poll is more focused on your organization and more focused on AI. And the question is, how is your organization incorporating AI into the HR function? And this is a broad question. It could mean specifically workplace investigations, but it could also just mean generally. Is your HR organization beginning to incorporate AI? And possible answers are no action. You've taken no action. Your organization has taken no action to incorporate AI. Second possible answer is you've begun some informal discussions, but you don't really have any concrete plans at this point. Third option, you're actively implementing AI tools. And fourth, probably a rare group, but you have extensive experience using AI tools in HR. So we'll get some responses from all of you on this poll. And these are the responses that I would expect, given how new this technology is. About 32% of you said your organization has taken no action to date. About 49% of you, which is that's about where I would expect most of our attention to be. You've had some informal discussions about AI in your HR function, but you have not made any concrete plans. And then 18% of you have indicated you are actively implementing AI tools. And it looks like we have one solitary person who has extensive experience using AI tools in HR. So that's fantastic. And I appreciate your answering those polls. It gives us an idea of kind of what the community is that we are speaking with today. Okay, let's move on. This is an overview of what we're going to cover today. I mentioned before that I want to level set on what investigations are. So we're going to spend just maybe 10 or 15 minutes talking generally about what constitutes an investigation. What do we mean when we talk about workplace investigations in human resources? And what is the state of investigations? Second, we need to have a common understanding of what we mean by generative AI. What do we mean by artificial intelligence? What do we mean in particular by this concept of generative artificial intelligence? So we'll spend a little bit of time on that topic. And then the bulk of our time will be spent on discussing the impact of generative AI on workplace investigations. And I'll share my thoughts, which are derived from our firm's work in this area, conversations that I've had with other professionals in this space. I should mention too that I'm very involved in an organization which I certainly encourage folks to consider, which is the Association of Workplace Investigators. And some of the thoughts that I'm sharing today are born out of conversations I've had with other professionals in the area of workplace investigations. And then finally, we'll leave a little bit of time for Q&A and appreciate any questions that you may have. As Julia said, I'm happy to take questions as we go today, but I may pause questions just to make sure that we cover the content we have, but I'm certainly happy to answer questions after we finish the webcast. Okay, let's level set a little bit. What do we mean by an investigation? I'm going to give you a very dry, lawyerly answer to this question. I would say that an investigation is a methodical process for responding to complaints or concerns about employee conduct that is reasonably designed to elicit the facts of what happened so the employer can take appropriate action. Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. I think there's several key parts to a workplace, to a competent or a good workplace investigation. First of all, is a methodical process. You have to have a methodical process to how you approach responding to an employee complaint with an investigation. So not every organization has to do investigations the same, but in your organization, you should follow a similar process for every investigation. Second key concept here is an investigation is designed to respond to concerns about employee conduct. So they may be a complaint related to harassment or discrimination. It may be a complaint just related to misconduct like bullying, but generally you're responding to a concern about another employee's conduct. The third important concept here is an investigation should be reasonably designed to help determine what happened. What are the facts? What do we ultimately believe happened based on the complaint that's been raised? Hopefully you know that workplace investigators don't have to be perfect. We do our best. We follow a fair, thorough, prompt, impartial process, and we do our best to come to a reasoned conclusion about what happened based on the complaint that we're investigating. But the case law is on our side that says, look, we do the best we can, and we act in good faith, and we take reasonable steps to do a fair, thorough, and prompt investigation. But realistically, we're operating under what's called a preponderance of evidence standard. Preponderance of evidence means we have to determine, is it more likely than not that the conduct occurred or did not occur? And that's about a 50% plus standard of proof. Our job really is to make sure that we do a competent and thorough job, but we also have to make sure that it's simply reasonably designed to elicit that answer. Finally, key piece here, at the end of the day, we conduct a workplace investigation so that the employer can take reasonable steps in response to the concern. Maybe there is a finding of egregious misconduct and there's an employment action that has to be taken, or maybe the concerns are not substantiated and there's a level of mediation or dispute resolution that can happen that can bring the workplace back together again so people can work together productively. But ultimately, we do an investigation so that we can learn what happened and we can take appropriate action. So that's what I mean when I talk about a workplace investigation. And I'll say that an investigation can look like just a few quick discussions in the HR office, talking to a couple different people in an employment setting, and some resolution that comes out of that discussion. Or it can be a lengthy process with dozens of witnesses and lots of documents and a lengthy report. There's a lot of different ways that an investigation can appear, but I think those elements we just discussed are key to it. And as we move into this discussion today, we'll cover more about how AI might integrate into each of those areas of the investigation process. So the state of investigations, my guess is these 4 areas are things that you are seeing in your HR functions generally and probably specifically with regards to workplace investigations. First, we see it, and I hear it from my colleagues who are internal, there is a higher volume of complaints than ever before. Over the past decade or so, the volume of complaints and employee concerns that have been raised has just increased exponentially. That puts a lot of pressure on internal investigation teams and internal HR professionals to respond to this high volume of complaints in a fair and responsible way. Second kind of state of investigations issue is there is greater scrutiny on how investigations are conducted. We see this from employee representatives, from unions. We see this from attorneys who are representing employees or former employees in litigation. We see this in how the media is considering whether fair investigations were conducted in response to issues that are brought to the attention of the media. So as investigators, we're facing greater scrutiny. There's also increased cost pressure. Hiring an external firm to do an investigation is a costly endeavor. And it's one of the reasons I think it's so important that internal investigators are well equipped to conduct investigations internally and to resolve employment disputes in that manner so that every investigation doesn't have to go to an outside firm. So cost pressure is another factor. And then finally, what brings us to this discussion today is an explosion of technology in the HR function generally. AI is just the latest iteration of technology that's promising to upturn our practice and our HR function. But technology continues to play an important role in investigations. So those are some of the key issues that my guess is you're facing in your HR practice. Let's talk briefly about the types of issues that you might be dealing with in a workplace investigation. A lot of the investigations you probably are tasked with address statutory EEO violations. These are violations that potentially these are complaints that potentially violate harassment, discrimination, retaliation laws, either at the state level or the federal level. An example of an EEO complaint might be where an employee complains that a manager reposted a meme with racist slurs in the company's internal messaging system. So you may receive this complaint and you have a duty to investigate that under both your policy and under the law that governs your jurisdiction. The other type of investigation issues you might face are misconduct. That's a pretty broad category. But when we talk about misconduct violation issues, I'm really talking about things like bullying. Bullying is sort of egregious conduct in the workplace, abusive conduct, for example, but abusive conduct that is not tied to a protected characteristic like age or gender or race or any of those commonly protected characteristics. An example of a misconduct investigation might be where 3 employees complain that a new manager is bullying them by criticizing their work and past practices. So it's not really tied to any protected characteristic, but it's just unfair or inappropriate treatment in the workplace. Now, probably less common, hopefully less common for most of you, is investigations that involve criminal conduct. But these still come up for us. An example of this is where an employee is alleged to be, selling THC gummies in the workplace, or where an employee is alleged to have engaged in sexual assault or battery towards another employee. You may have an obligation under your policy to look into these concerns, but you may also have an obligation to report this to an external law enforcement agency. And then finally, the final type of issue that might come up are just performance-related investigations. This may fall in the category of an employee who is violating the attendance policy or is constantly clocking in late or not following other performance-related policies. Sometimes these do come up in the context of an investigation. Okay, so that's sort of an overview of some of the issues that we may face as an investigator. Let's talk a little bit about the investigation process, because as we dig into this topic today about artificial intelligence, we're going to come back to this slide and really highlight how artificial intelligence might come into play in these different steps of the investigation process. So I would break down the investigation process into these 4 categories. The first step is intake. How do you learn about the complaint in the first place? Maybe an employee simply sends you an email and says, my manager is mistreating me. Maybe you have an anonymous hotline system set up and you receive either an audio phone call or an anonymous message from a complainant about a concern. But that process of gathering the complaint and understanding what the complaint and the issues are is that first intake process. The second step is planning. How are we going to go about this investigation? One of the most important elements of a good investigation is to have a clear description of your methodology. How did you go about conducting the investigation? Because that's going to show that you conducted a fair, thorough, and impartial investigation. The third step is the evidence gathering phase. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. This is talking to witnesses, understanding what was observed or what was not observed, talking to people who were present when the conduct occurred, who may have some perception or awareness of what occurred. It's reviewing documents and emails and other information like that to evaluate the complaint that you received. And then the final stage is documenting the investigation. And documenting the investigation, in my view, takes several forms. One, it's documenting your methodology so that any future individual or stakeholder who's evaluating your investigation knows how you went about your investigation. It's also documenting what your findings are, having a clear findings statement that says, I find by preponderance of the evidence, or more likely than not, that this conduct happened or it did not happen. And it's also finally documenting the reasoning for your finding. What is the analysis? And in our practice, when we train internal HR professionals and when we train the attorneys who work for our law firm, we really highlight the importance of having a clear methodology, having a clear finding statement, and having a clear balance analysis that explains the reasoning for how you came to the conclusion that you came to. So those are the four critical elements of the investigative process. Let's keep digging into some skills that I think every investigator needs to have in order to be effective at conducting fair, thorough, and impartial investigations. Now, I think these 5 factors are going to be pretty familiar to most of you, especially those who have an experience with investigations. One, an investigator should be able to define the scope of the investigation. That means, what are we investigating? We know what the complaint is. Maybe we receive a 5-10-page written, single-spaced written complaint from an employee, but what are the real allegations that we're looking into? That's defining the scope. A second important skill for an investigator to have is knowing how to interview parties and witnesses. Most of us who end up in the HR and employment law function are pretty good naturally at conversing and connecting with people. Tends to attract people who are empathic and have good emotional intelligence and communication skills. And that's essential for interviewing parties and witnesses. But it's also important to make sure that you understand how to ask questions in a way that does not elicit bias, that does not lead people to a specific answer. So interviewing parties and witnesses is a key function. Another important skill is being able to gather evidence. And that's not just interviewing witnesses, but it's knowing what documents we could find or should be able to find. It's knowing how to work with the IT department to gather emails and other documents. It's knowing what electronic evidence might be out there. Are there instant messages or Slack messages? Are there social media posts or comments to social media that could be relevant to this investigation? And how do we go about gathering that? Fourth skill here is being able to analyze the reliability of evidence. This also has to do with understanding credibility. How do we evaluate whether or not statements that a witness said are credible or reliable, that we can rely on them in making our findings? And then finally, we need to be able to document our findings. And as I said before, I think the real critical issue here is being able to document clear findings, explain why you found some evidence to be reliable or not, and explain why you made the findings you made. So these are 5 skills that you're probably all pretty familiar with, and you would all agree, yep, these are skills that we need to have as an investigator. But the new skill is understanding technology and understanding how the impact of generative AI on our investigations. Being able to conduct an investigation requires an understanding of technology, and as AI plays a greater and greater role in the workplace, it's being able to understand how AI can impact investigations, both for us as an investigator, how can we use AI, but also how is AI going to impact what parties and witnesses and other stakeholders do with the technology. So let's dive into this topic. Let's first of all start by just level setting on what we mean by generative AI. To do this, I want to talk about what makes generative AI different, because you probably have an understanding that machine learning or artificial intelligence is not a new concept. In fact, the first examples of artificial intelligence in some form date back to the 1950s. So really, when we talk about artificial intelligence, this is not a new concept. It's something that's been around a long time, that computer professionals have been researching for a long time. And in fact, machine learning, which essentially is a form of artificial intelligence, is something that we use every day whether we know it or not. And we'll give you some examples of that in a second. So if machine learning and artificial intelligence have been around for so long, what is it that makes the new generation of generative AI so significant? And I want to talk about this in the context of understanding what kind of the previous machine learning functions were and what we now mean by generative AI and why generative AI is so important. So historically, machine learning has really meant a computer's ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. So if you can imagine, it would be pretty difficult to program a computer with all of the knowledge and all of the answers in the entire world that could be possible in any language. Like that's not feasible. So what machine learning has focused on is using algorithms, or basically computer formulas or programs, to detect patterns and learn how to make predictions and recommendations based on those patterns. So that's what machine learning really is all about. Now, historically and typically, machine learning has used structured data. That is, enormous volumes of structured data, generally organized in rows and columns, but data that is so voluminous that a human cannot effectively or efficiently process it. So an example, this is a silly example, but here's an example of typical machine learning. Let's say that you want to ask Google to find pictures of cats, or you want a tool to go find pictures of cats. You upload 5 or 6 different pictures of cats, and you ask the system to go and find other similar pictures. So the tool can evaluate what the data is behind those images of a cat, and it can go out and it can find other similar images and pull back other great cat pictures for you. Now, what's important about this is it's finding information or data that already exists. There already are pictures of cats that it's going to go out and search and find for you. Now, let's talk about what generative AI and what makes generative AI unique. Generative AI describes algorithms that we can use to create new content. And that's really the key issue here, is that generative AI can create new content. That includes audio, text, images, simulations, video. And generative AI outputs can closely mimic human intelligence and human work product. Now, you'll hear the concept of unstructured data come up a lot with generative AI. And what unstructured data really means is just data that doesn't fit neatly into a table. Unstructured data might be volumes of text, like a 10-page employee complaint that you submit into, that you enter into your AI tool to learn to begin the investigation. Unstructured data could be large audio or video files. Basically, it's data that doesn't neatly fit into a table. Now, again, the key with generative AI is that it can review and analyze large volumes of written text or unstructured data, and it can produce, in response to a prompt, a work product that looks a lot like what a human would produce. And we'll give you some more examples of this since we're talking in sort of esoteric terms right now. Another concept I want you to think about or understand is the concept of a large language model. You've probably heard this term. It often is abbreviated as LLM. And a large language model is a type of artificial intelligence program that can process, understand, and generate human language. LLMs are trained on large amounts of data using machine learning algorithms to learn the patterns and structures of human language. So an LLM is the basis, it's the foundation for the generative AI tools that you're starting to see come up on the marketplace. All right, so that's kind of a general overview of what generative AI is and why it's different from traditional machine learning. Let's talk about a couple specific examples of machine learning versus generative AI. So in machine learning, I gave you the example, a silly example of searching for other images of cats. That's one example. The spam filters that you have on your current email client, that's another example of machine learning. The system is evaluating based on inputs, based on data that's been fed to it. It's evaluating the likelihood that a given email is spam versus something you intend to read. You know that sometimes spam filters capture emails that it shouldn't capture. Fundamentally, machine learning is sort of a statistical assessment of what is more likely than not the outcome that the user is seeking. Sales forecasting is another tool that machine learning can accomplish, inventory inspections. So those are examples of machine learning. Generative AI, on the other hand, again, think about generative AI as something that is creating content that never existed before. If you've used ChatGPT or Claude or Llama or any of the other large language models produced by the large technology companies, these tools, in response to a prompt from you, create new content. For example, you may ask your, and this is happened to me. I have a teenage son, and before there were clear rules around this, he asked ChatGPT to write an essay on the birth of the American Revolution. And the ChatGPT came back with a new essay, an essay that had never been written before on the birth of the American Revolution. So that's an example of how you can use ChatGPT or a generative AI tool to create new content. Generative AI can also create new images, again, images that have never been created before, new sounds. It can also be used to maximize marketing efforts and to optimize a marketing program. So there's a lot of different ways that generative AI can be used, and we're going to move now to focus just on how generative AI could impact workplace investigations. Okay, now to level set this discussion, I want to go back to the slide that we discussed where we talked about the 4 areas of investigations. But before we do that, I think we have to remember a couple things about new technology. One is that a new technology, and this is, I read a book recently that really made this point, and I thought it was a compelling idea, which is new technology is we often overestimate how quickly new technology is going to change the landscape, but we also often underestimate how significant that change is going to be. So we overestimate how quickly it's going to happen, but we underestimate what the ultimate impact is going to be. And I think AI probably falls into that category. If you feel like you're behind on AI, you're not behind on AI. Everybody is trying to figure out how to incorporate and understand generative AI. So really, we're at the early stages of understanding generative AI and its impact on different areas of the workplace. Okay, so these, as a reminder, these are kind of the 4 main areas that we talked about earlier. The intake process, the planning process, the evidence gathering process, and documenting the investigation. So we'll spend a little bit of time now looking at each of these areas and talking about examples of how AI might be able to integrate into these functions for an investigator. Before I do that, I want to just raise a question here, which you should all be asking, which is why? Why would you consider AI in investigations? Why would we consider incorporating AI into our investigations practice? I mean, is it going to do our job? Is it going to do the job of an investigation for you? Is it going to make you faster at doing investigations? Is it going to make investigations better? Is it going to require you to handle more matters as an investigator? And I think these are all really important questions to evaluate as you're considering whether AI has a role in your HR function generally and specifically in the investigation function. From my perspective, there are kind of 2 main reasons or reasons that we should consider AI. One, I think we need to be knowledgeable about it just from a professional responsibility perspective. But 2, AI has the ability to analyze and summarize information effectively, and it has the ability to review large volumes of unstructured data and provide a summary or identify specific issues that are raised. And so I think AI has the potential to be an important tool in the investigative process. One thing I want to emphasize, though, and we'll talk about this throughout the rest of our discussion today, is AI is not an end-all solution. It is not. We are never, at least not in any near term, going to press a button and have AI complete the investigation for us. AI really needs to be seen as yet another tool that we have to conduct good and effective investigations. Okay, so with that, let's talk a little bit about the intake process. How might we use AI, generative AI in the intake process. So one way that we could use AI is to help transcribe an oral complaint. Maybe you have an anonymous reporting hotline, and you receive a transcript from a complainant, and they leave a voice message for you. Now, having a computer system or a tool that can provide a electronic transcription of a complaint or an interview is not new. That has been around for some time. But if you have any experience with those tools, you know that they're pretty inaccurate because people speak differently. Some people speak louder, some people speak more quietly. People have different accents and how they speak. What AI can do is it can refine the transcription and produce a higher quality transcription because it can understand what the likely information is that the person is trying to convey. So an AI supported transcription tool can produce a better transcript of a oral piece of audio, of spoken audio. So that's one thing that it could do in the intake process. Another thing that an AI tool could do in the intake process is it could, if you uploaded or gave the AI system access to all of your historical complaints and employee issues, it could categorize a new complaint based on those past cases. So AI is really effective at reviewing data in a new complaint, for example, and comparing it to past cases. Now, this is not the same as just doing a Boolean search in your case management system and saying, show me all matters that have the word harassment in them. That's a search function. AI has the ability to review unstructured data, meaning data that's not in an easy table, but just a bunch of documents saved in a folder, and identify which of those cases relate to harassment, or which of those cases relate to race harassment or gender harassment or something specific like that. So AI could be used to just at the beginning stage, categorize this new complaint based on past cases that you've dealt with. Another useful tool, and I imagine for many of you, this is an important step, is being able to manage metrics and tracking for employee complaints or for complaints and disputes, employee disputes that come up. So AI can effectively review unstructured data, historical unstructured data, and help you develop metrics to categorize how many complaints you've had that relate to a certain topic, for example. Now, as we're going through this discussion today, I welcome you to share other ideas in the chat that you can imagine AI being useful for. I'm giving you some of the key use cases that I think an AI system can offer, but feel free to offer other suggestions or ideas or questions about how you think AI might be able to benefit or impact investigations. The final opportunity for generative AI in the context of intake is integration with a case management system. I know from speaking to several different case management companies that they are working on ways to integrate AI into an existing case management system at that intake stage to make the intake of a new complaint easier to categorize, easier to add to metrics, and easier to evaluate. So those are 4 examples of how AI could impact the intake stage. Let's move on through our investigation process and talk about planning. So how might a generative AI impact the planning process? Again, planning is sort of an amorphous concept in an investigation because it isn't just one step, it isn't just one process that you begin and then complete. Planning really happens throughout the investigation process, right? So when you get that first complaint, you're going to do some planning around who you need to interview, what evidence you need to gather. You're going to do some planning around what you think the ultimate report might look like that you have to produce. You're going to do some planning around what stakeholders or who you have to inform about the outcome of the investigation. So that's what we mean by the planning phase. And here are some ways that generative AI could probably help in the planning phase. One thing, as I've mentioned a couple times, is that AI is really effective at reviewing and synthesizing information and extracting information from large volumes of unstructured or written data. So to this first point, generative AI can be used to identify potential issues or allegations, or even help define the scope. So let's say you receive, a number of, 5 complaints from 5 different individuals about the same respondent, and you want to quickly understand, like, what are the key issues that these employees are complaining about. You can ask the AI tool to review those complaints and summarize what are the main allegations that these employees are raising. That's something that you can easily do yourself, but it's going to take longer than just asking an AI tool to do it. Along those same lines, another thing the AI tool can do is it can identify potential witnesses and evidence. So again, going back to those 5 written complaints that you received from 5 different employees, the AI tool can review those and provide a recommendation about who some potential witnesses are that you should interview as part of this investigation, and what evidence might you want to gather. Now, here's the important point. AI isn't going to just say, oh, okay, this one complaint mentioned this one email, so you should go find that email. The AI tool is going to speculate a little bit, just like an assistant investigator would, and say, well, this person is raising concerns about, a history of mistreatment and bullying conduct. And so the AI tool may come back and recommend that you should go back and look at historical emails and historical communications between these parties to see if there's any evidence to support this allegation of bullying conduct, right? So again, think of an AI tool as an assistant. It's the assistant investigator who's going to help you brainstorm and speculate about what potential evidence you could gather. Now, another concept here is being able to identify potential policy violations. I think this is one of the more useful use cases for an AI tool. If you have a robust set of policies, as I'm sure all of your organizations do, one of your primary concerns when you get a new complaint is being able to identify whether there are potential policy violations implicated by this new complaint. So again, if you go back to those 5 written complaints that we've received from 5 different employees, we can query the AI tool to tell us, comparing these 5 complaints to our HR policies, to our employment policies, which policies are potentially violated by the conduct alleged in these 5 complaints. And the AI tool can produce a response and say, okay, these are the potential policy violations that you should be aware of. Importantly, the tool, a well-designed tool, can also cite back and say, okay, this is where this particular complaint raised this. This is where, this is the specific policy that may be implicated by this conduct. And that's the type of information that you should be seeking with an AI tool. And we touched on this earlier, but an AI tool can also compare a complaint against past cases. And that may be helpful if you're trying to determine, how am I going to go about investigating this? I want to look at some other cases where we've dealt with similar issues to this. If you have an AI tool set up that can refer back to other cases, other matters in your database, in your HR management system, HRIS system, you can query the system to identify other similar cases. And again, I want to make a distinction. This isn't just about being able to query fields in a case management system. It's being able to ask a tool to go look at volumes of unstructured data in a file folder and say, okay, well, it looks like this particular complaint involved a similar situation where an individual who is over the age of 40 and who was of a certain race raised a concern, so that you can go look at that case and understand how it was handled before, or what the approach was for the investigation. So again, an AI tool you can ask it very specific questions, and it can help go back and review that information from other sources that you have given it access to. Okay, so now we've talked about planning. Let's move on and talk about the evidence gathering process. When we're talking about the evidence gathering process in AI, I'm really talking about how we can use the AI tool to help us during the evidence gathering process, the interview process. A couple examples. One, you could use the AI tool to prepare a topic outline or suggested questions for an interview. Two, as we talked about earlier in the intake process, you could use the AI tool to transcribe interviews while you're conducting the interview. If, for example, you conduct the interview on a video conference tool like Zoom or Teams, and you have a transcript prepared, you can use the AI tool to prepare that transcript and also evaluate what information you're gathering during the interview. And that's the last point here. You can use the tool to prompt the investigator as to whether they have adequately addressed topics in the interview. So you can have that tool kind of listing in on the interview that you're conducting and identifying whether you're hitting all of the points that you originally intended to do so. Okay, let's talk about the last step in the investigation process, documenting the investigation. This is probably one of the areas that we are going to we want AI to do the most in, and it's also an area where we have to be the most careful in. So I think there are some important use cases for generative AI in the documenting process. One is you can use AI to summarize evidence. You can summarize witness statements or witness notes. You can use it to summarize emails or other documents. And that can be really useful if you're preparing a report that just has a summary of the evidence you gathered. You could also use it to summarize factual background information that is just sort of general information that provides context for the investigation. You could use the tool to refine or describe the issues and the scope that you're investigating. I think all three of those are pretty good use cases for generative AI. But what about writing the analysis or making findings? This is where I would really emphasize the importance of the human role. It is essential that the human overseeing or using the AI tool is the one who is using their judgment to make findings and prepare or draft the analysis. So ultimately, we can't cede control over the findings to a computer system or a computer tool. As the investigator, we have to be the one who's making the findings. Now, you may be able to use the AI tool to help elicit information that supports your findings or your analysis, but I really want to emphasize that this is an area where I think it's important that you don't ask an AI tool to write the analysis for you, for example, or to make the findings for you. That really is your responsibility as the investigator. Okay, so we've kind of covered in those four main areas where generative AI has the potential and the ability with the current technology to be useful in the investigation process. For our last few minutes here, let's pivot to a couple other topics. One is complete pivot, which is how might witnesses or parties use generative AI? And I think this is something you really have to be careful about as an HR professional, whether you're an investigator or working in employee relations, understanding how your employees may be using generative AI. So we have already seen employees use generative AI to draft a complaint. So they may say to ChatGPT, I feel like I've been sexually harassed. Please write my complaint for me. And generative ChatGPT will produce a written complaint that may or may not be totally accurate or reflective of what the employee's experience is. AI can be used to manipulate or create evidence, as I've discussed. It can be used to create images or even sounds. Here's a chilling example of this. You may have seen this in the news. This came out in April of 2024 in a CNN report. There's a principal at Pikesville High School who supposedly was caught making racist and anti-Semitic comments. The principal was put on administrative leave and an investigation was conducted. He denied making the offensive remarks and said it wasn't even his voice on the recording. After a thorough investigation, it was concluded that the recording was indeed a deep AI fake. So that is a really chilling example of how people, bad actors, can use AI to create evidence that if you don't do a thorough job analyzing it, could really jeopardize and upend your investigation and upend the findings that you're going to make. So being aware of and careful about how parties and witnesses use generative AI is essential. Yes, Cindy, I agree. It is terrifying to think about, and I appreciate that comment. It's why it's so important for us to be educated on the potential of AI and also educated and skilled on how to conduct an investigation. I'm sure that the way they ultimately discovered that it was a deep fake was by really talking to the individuals who could have been present, analyzing the information that they could gather, and ultimately coming up with reasoned findings. So I may be optimistic here, but I think that good investigation skills are our best defense against that kind of risk. All right, let's talk just briefly. I want to highlight some of the key risks of generative AI. And these are issues that I encourage you to look more into if you're considering incorporating AI into your HR function. One is hallucination. You've probably heard this term several times. Hallucination in AI is really what we're really talking about there is the AI tool creating information or creating facts that are false, that don't exist. So an example of that is if you ask an AI tool to summarize a witness statement. Let's say you did an interview, you had a transcript of the interview, and you ask the AI tool to summarize what the witness said and to include quotations of what the witness said about alleged sexual harassment, for example. Some tools, if they are not well designed to support workplace investigations, for example, or HR functions, will fabricate quotes from the complaint, from the witness transcript. So you have to be really careful about how a given tool is calibrated and designed to avoid hallucinations like that. If you play around with ChatGPT or some of the other tools, you may find that they sometimes hallucinate. It's something that you'll read a lot about in the news media. So be really clear on how a tool is designed to prevent hallucination. Another important concept is bias. Large language models, which serve as the foundation for the AI tools we're talking about, are based on terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of volumes of data. And some of that data has implicit bias built into it. I'll give you an example of this. If you ask an AI tool to create an image of a business meeting, the likelihood that the AI tool is going to create an image of a bunch of older white men sitting around a conference room table is pretty high. So sometimes there can be built-in bias in an AI tool to assume that a certain category of person is most likely to be in the setting that you're asking it to produce. So you have to be careful about bias and understand what steps the tool you're evaluating is using to mitigate bias in its outputs. We have to be careful as investigators and professionals of relying too heavily on AI to produce or perform the functions that we're asking it to do. Security and confidentiality are a huge concern with AI tools. You should very carefully read the security policies of any tool that you're considering using. Many of the publicly available and free tools are very clear that they do not protect or purport to protect the confidentiality of the information that you upload. So you really have to understand, going with the next topic, ownership of the data, you really have to understand how any AI tool you're using is managing confidentiality of information you upload and who owns the data that the AI tool produces and who owns the data that you upload to it. So for me, that's outside of my expertise. And so I'm going to rely heavily on my IT professionals and my cybersecurity professionals to make sure that we are using a tool that's properly structured to protect our confidential and proprietary employee information. And then the final risk here is, boy, this technology is changing at light speed. And just because there's a tool today that looks like it's going to work great doesn't mean that the tool is going to be relevant in 3 months from now. So you really have to be cognizant of how quickly technology is changing before you make a large investment in a new system. So those are some of the risks that I think are worth considering. Before we get to questions and other comments, I want to identify what I think some of our key ethical obligations are around using generative AI. So first of all, really, as the user, you are responsible for everything the tool does. It is not an acceptable response to say, well, I don't know why it came up with that finding. I just asked the tool to make that finding, and that's what it concluded. As the investigator or as the HR professional, it's really our responsibility to know what the ultimate finding is, what the basis for that finding is, and not to defer too much authority to the AI tool. Two, understand that it's not a one-button solution. As much as I would like to be able to just ask the AI tool to write my report for me, I know that that's not the right approach, and that's not the right answer. Certainly, the way the technology is functioning at this time, it is not capable of conducting and analyzing evidence in a fair, thorough, and complete way, in the way that courts and parties and our employers would expect us to do as an investigator. So it's not a one-button solution. It's an assistant who can help us identify and evaluate and understand information. But at the end of the day, we are the ones that have to do the hard work. Three, disclose the use of AI and mitigation strategies. So I would encourage you, if you're using AI, I would encourage you to understand what obligations you have to disclose to your leadership, to parties in the investigation, to the organization at large, that you were using AI for the tool, for the output that you're producing. As an attorney, for example, I'm based in California. We are required, if we use AI in our legal services, we're required to disclose that to the client. And I think that's probably a good practice, whether you're an attorney or not. And fourth, I really don't think we can emphasize enough the importance of understanding bias in AI tools and how that could implicate outcomes that are negative and contrary, or that really violate our policies and are contrary to individuals in our workforce. So understanding bias is critical. Okay, I've only left a few minutes, but we do have a few minutes left. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer any of those questions that you may have. And I see one question here in the Q&A, and it is, if an investigator used AI to listen in on an interview, we'd need to disclose that at the beginning of the call, right? Linda, that's a great question. And I want to highlight what this raises. This raises an issue of when we have an obligation to disclose to the parties in an investigation that we're recording the interview. Now, many states, not all states are the same on this rule. I'm based in California, and in California, we're called a two-party consent state, which means if we're recording a meeting or recording an interview, we have to get the consent of the other individuals in that meeting before we can record it. In a two-party consent state like California, I absolutely believe that having an AI tool listening in and taking a transcription would constitute a recording, and we would have to disclose that at the beginning of the meeting. Now, in a state that is not a two-party consent state, I think you should seek legal counsel on this point. I think it's still a good idea to just let people know that you're recording or using an AI tool to listen in, just to maintain trust and rapport. But that's something you may want to consult with your leadership on. All right, I think we've addressed the other open questions. Happy to answer any other questions that you may have.
One other question that was submitted in advance, Eli, was asking if there are any other legal concerns we should be aware of when we're implementing AI.
Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate that. So I think it depends a lot on the jurisdiction that you're in. So I think it's important whether, to understand what opinions, legal opinions or ethical opinions that your state has produced related to the use of artificial intelligence. Many states, and even at the federal level, are considering new legislation to address and regulate artificial intelligence. And so, to my knowledge, there's not been a lot of action, not a lot of new cases, there have not been a lot of new statutes adopted, but almost every state is considering changes or regulations related to artificial intelligence. So I think the best thing I can tell you is to stay apprised of what those rules and changes are, and make sure that you're considering that before you integrate AI into your tool, into your workflow. All right. Well, we are right just at the top of the hour. I want to emphasize again how much I appreciate everybody taking time out of their day to meet with us and talk about this important topic. As Julia said earlier, our company, VM Mastered, our focus is helping internal investigators learn how to do high quality investigations. So we're always happy to talk with you about training opportunities for workplace investigations. Also, if you have additional questions that we didn't get to today, you're welcome to reach out to us. Our contact information is on the screen here, and we're happy to discuss this topic in more detail with you. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to hr.com to close us out.
Thank you. This concludes our webcast today. I would like to thank our presenter as well as all of you for joining us. If you would like to view this webcast again, the recording and slides will be available on hr.com on our archived webcast page. Check your account for your credits. Those will arrive within 2 business days. We also send out an email with the credit information. Just a reminder to the audience to fill out a quick feedback survey that will open on a new tab on your screen. It only takes a few minutes, and your valuable input is key to improving the quality of our webcasts. Thank you all for joining us today. Hope you have a good rest of the day.